Hi, grade civic students, Mr. Messerschmidt and Mrs. Miller here. We are going to be talking to you today about the Revolutionary War, causes, and kind of a timeline of events. This is definitely more of an overview, and we'll be going over some of these events a little bit more in depth with you. So here we go. Okay, so one of the root causes of the Revolutionary War was another war, the French and Indian War. Also known as the 7 Years' War. So this was a fight between the British and the French for territory out towards the Ohio River Valley. And the British really wanted that territory. The French really wanted that territory. The most Native Americans came in on the side of the French. The British actually ended up winning the war, but they had to spend a ton of money to do so. They were in a lot of debt. So that brings up some of the things that Mr. Messerschmidt's going to talk to you about in a minute, the British being in high debt after the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ended that French and Indian War. You're going to hear Treaty of Paris again later as well. The British won Canada from the French and Florida from the Spain in that from Spain in that treaty, and they also got control of that Ohio River Valley that they were concerned about. So what are some things that the British started to do to us after the French and Indian War there?
The other thing that's important to note is at this point in history, most European countries wanted land. They were trying to grab as much land everywhere in the world as possible. So now after this, the French and Indian War, the king said, I need money. So what did he do? He looked at the 13 colonies and he said, all right, this is the place where I can make money. And he started taxing those colonies. One of the first was the Sugar Act, and that taxed sugar, wine, and coffee. And there are things that the colonists really enjoyed and things that they couldn't get. We don't grow coffee in the United States at this point, or tea, or wine to the extent that they liked or were used to. So the king said, okay, this is a great source of revenue for me by taxing those things. And then in 1763, the king ordered the Proclamation of 1763. Which said that colonists could not move past a certain line, a certain point to the west of the colonies. And he did this for a couple of reasons. He did this because it was easier to protect them. So if British troops had to come in and protect us from Native Americans, it was easy to do that. And also he kept more control over the colonists. But the colonists are like, hey, look over there. There's more land. It's cheap, or it's free, or it's whatever. But there were some issues with the Native Americans on that. But the colonists just saw this as, hey, all of a sudden, we're free and happy. And now all of a sudden, the king, who's 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, is starting to change things really dramatically. And I think the colonists are okay with change because they understand that they have this obligation to the king. But now things are happening really quickly.
They also really liked sugar because it kept their rotten food edible a little bit longer since they didn't have refrigeration.
That sounds good. So the king...
Hi, Mr. Gomez.
Get out, Mr. Gomez. The king realized that there was the colonists weren't happy and started hearing of some uprising. So one of the things that the king did is he sent troops to the colonies, and he said to the colonists, you will allow a soldier to stay in your house. This was called the Quartering Act. So the king was smart because that was free. He didn't have to build barracks. He didn't have to provide food. He made the colonists do it. And if a soldier's in my house, now the soldiers are listening to what I'm saying. Am I planning something against the king? Am I saying something derogatory against the king? Because at this point in our history, if I said something bad about the king, I could be punished. I didn't have freedom of speech at this point. So now the colonists are seeing all these things as just taking advantage of their rights. One of these, then the king passed the Stamp Act. So anything that was printed, newspapers, playing cards, wills, birth certificates, calendars, anything printed had to have a special tax on it, showing the tax was paid on that. And one of the straws that sort of broke the camel's back was the Tea Act that said only tea from the company that the king owned could be sold here. It's a monopoly. You'll buy my tea only, and I can charge whatever I want. So the colonists were very angry about this. So one of the things that were done is the Boston Tea Party. To show their unhappiness and their anger, they dressed up like Native Americans, and they threw tea into the harbor.
It was a kind of like secret rebel group called the Sons of Liberty, which will come up later as well. Really neat how people started to like take a stand on the side of the colonists as well, knowing that they could literally be killed for going against the king. So that was some really brave activity there on their part.
And the amount of tea was equivalent to about $1 million in today's money. So back then, it was bad. So the king was angry. So the king then, in response to the Boston Tea Party, issued the Townshend Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, and he blocked off one of the major ports of 13 colonies was Boston Harbor. And he brought ships in, and he blocked the harbor, and he didn't allow any goods to come in from outside, and he didn't allow them to sell any goods until all of the money was repaid for the tea.
And then that ends up causing the people of Boston to be super upset. And we're going to do a separate little activity about the Boston Massacre. But eventually fighting breaks out between British soldiers and the colonists in Boston. And on a very particular incident called the Boston Massacre on King Street in Boston, some unarmed colonists, well, they were armed with rocks and snowballs, end up being killed by some British soldiers. We'll get into that a little bit more in depth later, but that really causes, some really harsh feelings on the side of the colonists that, now they have people being, killed in the streets by British soldiers.
And this is just one thing after another, after another, after another, and the colonists get to that breaking point where they're like, all right, we're not going to put up with this anymore.
The Navigation Act was probably the worst for the colonial economy, because it said that now all of a sudden the colonies could only sell their goods to England. They couldn't trade with anybody else. So they basically are just cut off from every other country than England, the mother country. That was one of the last acts that the king passed against them before the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774. So this is the first time that a group of like important people from the colonies get together and say, all right, what are we going to do? They decide to cut off trade with England, and they say in 1 year we're going to meet back here again in Philadelphia to assess, did our plan work? Is the king now like backtracking on some of his taxes and some of the acts that he passed against us? In the meantime, in that 1 year time span, the first battle of the war occurs at Lexington and Concord, which is near Boston, Massachusetts. The interesting thing about that, it kind of ended up as a colonial victory because more British soldiers were killed, but no one really won like territory or anything. So a lot of historians kind of see it as a draw.
But the interesting thing about that is here is Great Britain, the most powerful nation in the world. And they have these soldiers who are trained, and they have good weapons, and they have uniforms, and they have supplies. And they come here and they fight these ragtag little colonists who are, do you have a gun? Yeah, I might have a gun. I have extra bullets. And the colonists are fighting for their property, for their rights. And I think that
they have their heart in it.
Yeah. The British soldiers, I'm a soldier. This is my job. But the colonists are like fighting for their freedom and their property and their rights. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. And no one knows who shot the first shot at Lexington and Concord. It's kind of become known as the shot heard around the world because of how important it was in world history. However, no one knows really how that battle kind of started out. This leads to 1 year after the First Continental Congress in 1775. Now fighting has begun. The kind of some important people in colonial government meet back again in Philadelphia to say, all right, we're in this now. Like fighting has begun. We've got to declare our independence. We have to say, we are fighting against the British for our livelihood. They at this point say to Thomas Jefferson, hey, we need you to get up and write a Declaration of Independence, which 1 year later is read in Philadelphia for the first time on July 4th. Battle. So now we're really in it to win it here. We kept losing battles because, as Mash said, we were like a ragtag bunch of farmers and they were a well-trained army. What we did do was fight a little bit dirty. Finally, a couple years into the war, there's the Battle of Trenton, which is in New Jersey. On Christmas Day, we knew that British soldiers and some German soldiers who were helping them out would be a little worse for the wear because maybe they did some partying on Christmas Day. So George Washington and his men crossed the Delaware River in the middle of the night and basically sneak attack these British and German soldiers, and they win. Not surprisingly, because like I said, the British and Germans had been basically partying all day. This battle really kind of like snaps us into action, and our morale is up. Now we're like, hey, well, even if we had to fight a little dirty, we won. And that was an important battle for us. Battle of Yorktown is another one. This was like the last major battle of the war. We won basically with help from the French. We pushed the British soldiers like to the coastline in Virginia, and then the French naval troops came and basically cut them off from a naval
fleet.
My brain cut them off from retreating, via the ocean. So they were just stuck there. We'll talk more about that soon as well.
But speaking of the French, the enemy of my enemy
is my friend.
So there were a lot of people around the world who did not like the British. So when they saw these 13 little colonies stood up to the king, we got support from those people, especially the French. Now, the other thing that Mrs. Miller mentioned were these German soldiers. They're called Hessians, and they were professional soldiers. And the king hired these German soldiers, and they were bad. Like they didn't
vicious.
care. Yeah, vicious. So that was important to mention as well.
And we'll talk more about the French helping us in another activity as well. Articles of Confederation. So now, like after Yorktown, the British leave, we've won the war, and we basically had to replace British government with our own form of government. So we kind of in an epic failure create this document called the Articles of Confederation, which was not a very good governing document. It ends up being replaced later by the Constitution. And then around that same time, you also have Treaty of Paris 2.0. And this was a peace treaty signed to officially end the war. King George gave up, all claims to us, and we are officially then independent after that Treaty of Paris is signed in Paris.
So just going back in time, so we fight this war and we win, and now we're independent. But each of those 13 colonies sees themselves as independent. Like Pennsylvania had its own dollar, New Jersey had its own dollar, and each of those 13 colonies really had there was no cohesiveness to any of the other colonies. So something had to be done to try and unite, to tie those. So we have state governments right now, the Pennsylvania state government, but we needed a national government, if you will, something that unites those 13 colonies together. And that was the Articles of Confederation. That was the document that said, okay, we are a nation.
So we're going to talk about these events more in depth in the upcoming future, but we wanted to just kind of give you a little overview of some of the main events of the war to get us started with our talk. So I hope you guys had a good time watching this, and we will see you soon.